August 15th, 1958. Boulder County, Colorado. While attending Camp St. Malo, a Catholic boys' summer camp, a 10-year-old hearing-impaired boy named Bobby Bizup vanishes without a trace. Nearly 1 year later, some of Bobby's skeletal remains are discovered on a mountainside 3 miles from the camp, and it is believed that he wandered off and died of exposure. However, in 2021, a man comes forward and provides the authorities with a skull which he claims had been given to him by his father, and it is believed to belong to Bobby. Since multiple counselors who worked at Camp St. Malo would be accused of sexually abusing children, there is suspicion that Bobby may have become the victim of foul play and that a cover-up took place. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Warder, and this week, we're going to be tackling one of the most bizarre stories we've ever covered: the unexplained 1958 death of 10-year-old Bobby Bizup. This is a case which languished in obscurity for over 6 decades, but was suddenly thrust into the spotlight nearly 2 years ago after a truly unexpected development. And not surprisingly, I started getting inundated with requests to cover it on The Trail Went Cold. It involves a 10-year-old hearing-impaired boy named Bobby Bizup who went missing while attending Camp St. Malo, a Catholic boys' summer camp in Colorado. Nearly 1 year later, some of Bobby's skeletal remains were discovered 3 miles from the camp, and if you look at the original newspaper coverage from that time period, there was no reason to believe that this was anything more than a tragic story of a vulnerable boy getting lost in the wilderness and dying of exposure. However, things changed 6 decades later when an investigation was launched into a number of Catholic priests from Colorado who had been accused of sexually abusing children over the years. Before they entered the priesthood, some of these accused individuals had worked as counselors at Camp St. Malo during the summer of 1958, and one of them discovered Bobby's remains. This prompted Kevin Vaughn, an investigative reporter for the Denver-based TV station KUSA, to take a fresh look at Bobby's case, and he would make some surprising discoveries which seemed to indicate that there was a lot more to this story. Believe it or not, after the case started garnering publicity, a man came forward and provided the authorities with a child's skull which he believed may have belonged to Bobby. He had apparently been given this skull by his deceased father, who happened to be close friends with the former director of Camp St. Malo. At the time of this recording, the skull has not yet been positively identified as being Bobby's, but even so, the story has wound up going in a truly odd direction that no one was expecting. As a result, a new investigation into Bobby's case has officially been opened. While the discovery of this skull was a pretty big deal in the true crime community when the announcement first happened, it seems like the story has gone quiet again, and there haven't been any new developments in nearly 2 years. So I thought now would be a good time to cover it on The Trail Went Cold, though be forewarned that due to the subject matter involving the sexual abuse of children, this is going to be one of our more disturbing cases. Anyway, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the unexplained death of Bobby Bizup. Our story begins in Colorado in 1958, and our central figure is 10-year-old Robert Dennis Bizup, who goes by the name Bobby. Originally born on an Air Force base in California, Bobby now lives in Denver's Park Hill neighborhood and is the only child of his parents, Joseph and Connie Bizup. Joseph is a Master Sergeant in the United States Air Force who is stationed at Lowry Air Force Base, while Connie is a stay-at-home mom. Since Bobby has been nearly completely deaf since birth, he is a 5th grade student at a school for handicapped children. While Bobby wears a hearing aid, he can still barely hear at all and has difficulty speaking, so he communicates with sign language and is an accomplished lip reader. One of Bobby's favorite destination spots during the summer is Camp St. Malo, a Catholic boys' summer camp located in Boulder County near the unincorporated community of Allens Park. The camp originally opened in 1935 and rests at the foot of Mount Meeker next to Rocky Mountain National Park. One of the camp's most distinctive features is a chapel on the property known as the St. Catherine of Siena Chapel, which rests on a large rock formation and has since become known as the Chapel on the Rock. The camp is always open for 6 weeks during the summer and divided into separate 1-week sessions, which are each attended by a crew of 75 to 90 boys between the ages of 9 and 16. The camp's counselors also happen to be young seminary students who are studying to enter the priesthood. During the summer of 1957, Bobby attended 3 sessions at Camp St. Malo, and on August 10, 1958, he would return there for what would be his second session of that summer and the last week of the camping season. Now, in recent years, there's been some dispute about the circumstances of how Bobby disappeared, but for the moment, I'm going to share what was the official version of events. On August the 15th, Bobby went fishing at Cabin Creek and was a few hundred yards away from the main lodge, though there are differing accounts about whether he was alone or with a group of boys and counselors. The story goes that at around 6 p.m., Bobby was fishing in the creek and had an ice cream carton full of worms beside him when he was approached by one of the counselors, Terry Cowan. Cowan pointed at his watch in order to indicate to Bobby that it was nearly time for dinner and he needed to gather up his things and return to the camp. Bobby then nodded at Cowan to acknowledge that he understood him, but after Cowan walked away, Bobby was never seen alive again. After an hour passed, Bobby had still not returned to the main lodge for dinner, so the counselors launched a search for him. Bobby's fishing pole and carton of worms were apparently found, though there have been conflicting reports about whether they were discovered on a hillside near the camp or a full half-mile away. The creek where Bobby had been fishing was narrow enough to step across and just over a foot deep, and since he was an accomplished swimmer, it did not seem likely that Bobby fell into the water and drowned. When Bobby failed to turn up, the camp's director, Reverend Richard Heister, notified rangers from the United States Forest Service and the Boulder County Sheriff's Office. Over the next week and a half, there would be a massive search effort for Bobby, which involved hundreds of people, including the Rocky Mountain National Rangers, members of law enforcement, rescue experts, and volunteers, and bloodhounds and aircraft were also employed. Joseph Bizup actively participated in the search and was joined by 200 of his fellow airmen from Lowry Air Force Base, but Connie Bizup was left so devastated by her son's disappearance that she became seriously ill and had to be placed under a doctor's care. There would be a number of reported sightings of a boy matching Bobby's description in the nearby town of Estes Park. Some of them seemed particularly credible, as the witnesses described a boy who kept pointing to his mouth and ears and seemed to have trouble communicating, as if he was hearing impaired. Joseph expressed hope that Bobby had gotten scared about not showing up for supper at the camp like he was supposed to, so he decided to run away, and was actively avoiding the searchers to avoid getting into trouble. At one point, a pilot flew over the camp and surrounding area and dropped thousands of leaflets containing this message for Bobby. Quote, "Mother and father love you. We need you. Mother is sick. She needs you at home. We love you." End quote. However, a man who had been visiting the area from Illinois came forward and told the authorities that the witnesses at Estes Park likely mistook Bobby for his own 11-year-old son, who happened to be deaf and wore a hearing aid. When the search effort failed to find Bobby, Joseph told the press, quote, "We don't know what happened to our boy, but we don't think we will ever see him again." End quote. Even so, Joseph would continue to frequently return to the area to perform his own independent searches for Bobby. The child would remain missing for nearly 1 year until a trio of counselors from Camp St. Malo took a group of campers on a hike through the adjacent Rocky Mountain National Park on July 3, 1959. When they were about 3 miles away from the camp, they started heading up the east face of Mount Meeker, and one of the counselors, Neil Hewitt, said that he happened to look down into a ravine and noticed what appeared to be a scrap of clothing and a bone beneath some heavy underbrush. Hewitt grabbed the bone and the clothing and brought it back to the camp in order to show it to the director, Reverend Richard Heister, who subsequently contacted the Rocky Mountain National Park Rangers. The bone turned out to be a small human scapula, and since the clothing scrap seemed to match the description of the clothing Bobby had last been seen wearing, the Rangers decided to organize another search effort within the vicinity of Mount Meeker. They eventually wound up coming across some additional human remains, including another scapula, a clavicle, a humerus, several vertebra and vertebral discs, and a number of ribs. They also found 20 additional scraps of clothing, a red cap, and a Zenith hearing aid battery case, and nearly all of these items and remains were discovered in or around Cabin Creek, within 100 yards of the ravine where the original scapula had been. An extensive search of the area failed to turn up any additional remains, including the victim's skull, but the presence of the clothing scraps and the hearing aid battery case made it obvious that the remains belonged to Bobby. This development was not reported by the media until July the 9th, as Bobby's parents had been away on a trip to Pittsburgh and could not be reached, so they did not learn about the discovery of Bobby's remains until after they returned home to Denver, and Connie passed out upon hearing the news. At the time, there was no apparent evidence to suggest foul play, as the Boulder County coroner concluded that Bobby had likely wandered away from the camp and gotten lost, and his death was likely the result of exhaustion and exposure. Even though they were left devastated by their son's death, Joseph and Connie Bizup accepted the coroner's conclusion and had him interred at Fort Logan National Cemetery. The Bizups said they did not hold any resentment towards the camp or its counselors and praised them for having taken good care of Bobby during his time there. Joseph passed away in December of 2001 at the age of 81, while Connie died in 2008 at age 83. As for Camp St. Malo, it was closed down as a camp in 1984 before it was converted into a retreat and conference center, which was visited on one occasion by Pope John Paul II. Over the years, most of the buildings on the property would be destroyed or damaged by a fire and flooding, but the chapel on the rock is still standing today and remains a popular tourist landmark. The story of Bobby Bizup would fade from memory until it unexpectedly returned to the spotlight following a major scandal. In October of 2019, Robert Troyer, the former U.S. Attorney of Colorado, released a report titled Roman Catholic Clergy Sexual Abuse of Children in Colorado from 1950 and 2019. The report came about after an independent review of records from the Archdiocese of Denver, the Diocese of Colorado Springs, and the Diocese of Pueblo, as the diocese and the Colorado Attorney General's Office had agreed to fund an investigation into child sex abuse allegations against Catholic priests. While the final numbers have since increased, this initial report concluded that a total of 43 priests had molested at least 166 children in Colorado between 1950 and 2019, and most of these incidents were covered up by the church and never reported to the police. 3 of these children were abused at Camp St. Malo from the late 1940s until the 1960s, and one of them was victimized by the camp's original founder, Reverend Joseph Bassetti. While they were still seminary students at the time, 2 other accused priests in the report had been working at the camp as counselors when Bobby Bizup went missing. One of them was Harold Robert White, who has been accused of abusing at least 70 children and described as the quote-unquote most prolific clergy child sex abuser in Colorado history. White would be assigned to a total of 6 different parishes in one 21-year period, as the church likely responded to allegations of abuse against White by transferring him around. The amount of accusations became so large that White was finally removed from the priesthood in 1993. He was subsequently defrocked by the Vatican in 2004 before he died 2 years later at the age of 73. The other former counselor turned priest named in the report was Neil Hewitt, the same individual who found Bobby's scapula. After studying at St. Thomas Seminary in Denver, Hewitt was ordained in 1962, but decided to leave the priesthood 18 years later when he got married. The issues with Hewitt began in 2002 after a woman named Donna Ballantyne was going through a box of her deceased mother's papers and uncovered a letter which had been written by her cousin, Stuart Saki. 11 years earlier, Stuart had taken his own life via a self-inflicted gunshot wound, and this letter began with the words, quote, "Dear Neil, it's been 24 years since you sexually molested me. I have been an alcoholic for 24 years, end quote. The letter detailed sexual abuse that Stuart had suffered as a teenager from a priest who would take him on trips and use alcohol to groom him. Donna instantly figured out that the Neil her cousin was referring to was Neil Hewitt, who had been a big part of her family's life, so she took the letter to the Archdiocese of Denver and filed a formal complaint against the former priest. Another victim who was abused by Hewitt during his childhood was Michael Smolanek, who kept silent about it for decades, but decided to come forward after watching the 2015 Academy Award-winning film Spotlight, which detailed the real-life investigation by the Boston Globe into the systemic sexual abuse of children by Catholic priests. Michael eventually decided to file a formal complaint with the Archdiocese of Denver and even phoned up Hewitt to directly confront him. When Michael asked Hewitt if he remembered what he did to him, Hewitt immediately admitted to it. Hewitt would be defrocked by the Vatican in 2018, and a subsequent investigation has revealed that he sexually abused at least 9 children at 4 different parishes during his 18 years in the priesthood. Kevin Vaughn, an investigative journalist for Channel 9 News at the Denver-based TV station KUSA, decided to look into these allegations against Hewitt as part of their 9 News Wants to Know series. In April of 2019, Vaughn paid a visit to Hewitt, who was now 83 years old, at his home in Tucson, Arizona. While Hewitt would not agree to a formal interview, he did allow Vaughn to question him on his porch for 30 minutes while a camera filmed their conversation in the distance. When asked if the allegations Stuart Saki wrote about him in his letter were true, Hewitt replied, quote, yeah, pretty much. He also seemed to confirm Michael Smolanek's abuse allegations, stating, quote, I did do things that were wrong. I realize that. About all I could do is what I did with Michael, and just say I'm really sorry, end quote. During their conversation, Vaughn also brought up the death of Bobby Bizup, and Hewitt shared a surprising story. Hewitt acknowledged that he remembered Bobby during his time as a counselor at Camp St. Malo, and claimed that on the day Bobby went missing, he had been running the camp snack bar, and Bobby attempted to buy some candy from him. Hewitt said that he told Bobby that he had already had too many sweets and shouldn't have any more, so Bobby took off, and Hewitt never saw him again. Hewitt then stated, quote, I did not do anything to him, except not give him more candy. Well, Vaughn found this statement to be particularly odd, since he had not even accused Hewitt of any wrongdoing, and there was no mention of the snack bar story in any of the contemporary news accounts about the case. So Vaughn decided to take a fresh look at Bobby's story, and in November of 2020, his findings would be featured in a 9 News Wants to Know investigative series titled, What Happened to Bobby Bizup? After all these years, most of the original documentation from the case, including the police files and Bobby's autopsy report, could not be found, and all that existed was a single report from the Rocky Mountain National Park superintendent about the discovery of Bobby's remains. Vaughn noticed a very odd discrepancy in the report because even though Bobby's scapula and a scrap of his clothing had been found on Friday, July the 3rd, 1959, Reverend Richard Heister did not actually report the finding to the Rocky Mountain National Park Rangers until Monday, July the 6th. Even though Reverend Heister was deceased by this point, the 9 News segment featured interviews with his nephew, also named Richard, who was 11 years old and attending Camp St. Malo at the time Bobby went missing. Richard recalled an incident where he was at a gathering hall with a group of other campers when a boy suddenly pushed him out of the way and ran past him. Richard recalled that the boy seemed upset and said something unintelligible before he headed outside. Due to Bobby's difficulty speaking, Richard believed that the boy was him, and seems certain that this incident took place on August the 15th, 1958, right before Bobby vanished. This story would be corroborated by Roger Contour, who had been a sub-district ranger at Rocky Mountain National Park and involved in the recovery of Bobby's remains. Contour said that he had been told by other people from the camp that Bobby was extremely upset about something before he went missing. What also seems strange is that since the location where the remains were found was on a mountainside, Bobby would have had a clear view of Camp St. Malo in the distance, so the idea of him dying up there because he got lost really didn't seem to make much sense. In addition, the mountain was near Cabin Creek, where Bobby had supposedly been fishing before he vanished, so he easily could have followed the creek back to the camp. As a result of these discrepancies, the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch announced that they were going to open up a new investigation into Bobby's case, and a profile page for him was added to the cold case section of their website, labeling his case as a quote-unquote suspicious death. On December the 1st, 2020, the Colorado Attorney General's Office released a special Master's Supplemental Report containing additional child sexual abuse allegations which had surfaced against Catholic priests from Colorado, as the numbers had now increased to 52 priests being accused of molesting at least 212 children. The previous year, a man had come forward and accused a former priest named Gerald Rapola of sexually abusing him while he was a teenager in 1967. Thus far, Rapola has only been accused of abuse by one victim, but Rapola was transferred around a lot during his time in the priesthood, and he was actually removed from the ministry in 1970 in order to participate in professional counseling. Rapola was on a 1-year leave of absence before he succumbed to cancer in March of 1971. But what was particularly interesting is that Rapola had worked as a counselor at Camp St. Malo while he was a seminary student during the summer of 1958. Along with Neil Hewitt and Harold Robert White, this made Rapola the third counselor from that time period to be accused of sexual abuse. On December the 26th, 9 News aired a new 20-minute documentary titled Mystery on Mount Meeker, which revealed the new details which had recently been dug up about Bobby Bizup's case. The documentary was viewed by a Denver-based doctor named Tom McCloskey, and in May of 2021, it was announced that Tom had contacted federal authorities and provided them with a very unexpected item, a human skull. Tom's father, Joseph McCloskey, had also worked as a doctor, and when Joseph passed away in 1980, his son took possession of a skull he owned. While Tom could not remember too many details, he said that his father had told him the skull may have belonged to a boy who had disappeared from a camp. For years, Tom said he tried to identify the skull by checking through old news articles about the disappearances of young boys, but had no luck finding a match, and spent the next 4 decades keeping the skull inside a paper sack in his basement. It was not until Tom saw the Mystery on Mount Meeker documentary that he began to believe that the skull might belong to Bobby, particularly since his father had been a prominent member of the Catholic Church and close friends with Reverend Richard Heister, the former director of Camp St. Malo. Indeed, Reverend Heister's nephew Richard would confirm that federal authorities told him they believed his uncle had been in possession of the skull and for reasons unknown gave it to Joseph McCloskey before he died. When the discovery of the skull was shared by 9 News, Rich Orman, the senior deputy district attorney from Colorado's 18th Judicial District, shared these comments, quote, "It's appalling, it's astounding, and to me it shows a guilty mind. I don't think you do something like this to a family without a guilty mind. It staggers the imagination that a religious organization, like the Catholic Church or a portion of the Catholic Church, would act in such a fashion. You just don't hide that unless you have something to hide." End quote. It was announced that plans were being made to exhume Bobby's remains for the purposes of DNA testing and confirm that the skull actually belonged to him. But even though nearly 2 years have passed, no official announcement has been made about a positive identification, and there have not been any new developments in the investigation. So after nearly 65 years, there are still no conclusive answers about what actually happened to Bobby Bizup. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. Anyway, if you're a devout follower of true crime, you'll often encounter situations where a news story about a case comes out and goes viral on social media. You're not often going to see this for a case from all the way back in 1958, but I can tell you that when news about the discovery of this skull was released nearly 2 years ago, it was shared everywhere. Before this happened, I'd wager that only a handful of people had heard of Bobby Bizup's case, as it mostly just got coverage in the Colorado media, but I still vividly remember this story garnering a collective WTF reaction when it first broke. Like I mentioned in the intro, I started getting requests to cover this case on The Trail Went Cold, but I'm not the type of podcaster who likes to immediately pounce on a big story. I want to wait for all the facts to come in because there's always a risk of new developments taking place at any time, so any episodes I release about the case could immediately become outdated. However, it's been nearly 2 full years since the announcement about the discovery of the skull, and the authorities have not released any new information. Even though there were plans to exhume Bobby's remains for DNA testing, I see no indication that this has taken place, and have no idea if and when they're actually going to go through with it. Officially, the skull is still considered to be unidentified, and while I'm sure there's a good chance that it does belong to Bobby, we can't be 100% certain. So I thought now would be a good time to cover this case on The Trail Went Cold, because it has become quite a bizarre and disturbing mystery. Before these recent developments, Bobby's death was mentioned by David Paulides as part of his controversial Missing 411 series, which chronicles unsolved disappearances and deaths that have taken place in national parks and wilderness areas. I've been critical of Paulides and Missing 411 in the past, because it involves coming up with supernatural-themed explanations for cases which mostly seem to be nothing more than tragic stories of people getting lost and wandering off into the woods before they succumb to exposure. If you perform a search on YouTube, you will find a video that Paulides put together about Bobby's case, and he actually does make a valid point, which I agree with. It seems pretty illogical that Bobby would have died after getting lost, because his remains were found on a mountainside where he would have had a clear view of Camp St. Malo in the distance, so why did he not attempt to head back in that direction? However, once you learn that no less than 3 counselors working at the camp at that time were accused of being sexual predators, and one of them discovered the remains, there's a much more disturbing explanation for how Bobby wound up there. I've seen a lot of cases where someone's death was ruled to be a tragic accident, and their loved ones were insistent that they were the victims of foul play, but this case follows a completely opposite arc. When Bobby's remains were found in 1959, the official explanation was that he wandered off and got lost and succumbed to exhaustion and exposure, and if anyone had suspicions about foul play back then, they were never expressed publicly. Even though Joseph and Connie Bizup were left devastated by the loss of their son, they did not believe Bobby's death was anything more than a tragic accident, and even publicly thanked the staff of Camp St. Malo for their efforts to find Bobby and for treating him so well. While Bobby did not have an easy childhood because of his hearing impairment, it sounds like he still maintained a positive attitude and always seemed to have a great time whenever he attended the camp. The allegations that someone at the camp may have been responsible for Bobby's death did not come out until after Joseph and Connie passed away, but that may have been for the best, because I would have hated to see them going to their graves, believing their son had been murdered and would never receive justice. If you search through the archives at newspapers.com, all media coverage of Bobby's story came to an end after his remains were found, and other than a brief mention in the Missing 411 series, the case pretty much remained in obscurity for 60 years until Kevin Vaughn decided to take a fresh look at it. And this pretty much only happened because of the new investigation into allegations of child sexual abuse by Catholic priests from Colorado. If Vaughn hadn't attempted to interview Neil Hewitt about these allegations, and Hewitt hadn't made those odd remarks about Bobby Bizup, I'm not sure anyone would have noticed the suspicious discrepancies in Bobby's case. In retrospect, it really does seem apparent that there's a lot more to this than a simple death by misadventure. Okay, so for decades, the official story was that Bobby had been fishing at a creek and was told by one of the counselors that he had to return to the camp for dinner, but even though Bobby acknowledged that he understood his instructions, he never showed up. While the creek was only a few hundred yards from the main lodge, the assumption at the time seemed to be that Bobby somehow got lost during his attempt to go there and instead wound up on a mountainside 3 miles away where he succumbed to the elements. But like I mentioned earlier, even if Bobby did get lost and started trekking up the mountain, he still would have been able to see the camp in the distance and followed Cabin Creek in order to make his way back there. While knowing what we know now, it's possible that the entire story about Bobby going missing while fishing was completely fabricated. After all, even back then, there were contradictory reports from different sources about whether Bobby was fishing alone or with a group of other campers. It should be noted that the counselor who last saw Bobby, Terry Cowan, has never been accused of sexual abuse or any other wrongdoing, so I don't want to say he was intentionally lying in order to orchestrate a cover-up. But I would like to know if there were any other eyewitnesses who could corroborate seeing Bobby at the creek at that time. There are also contradictory accounts about the exact location where Bobby's fishing pole and his carton of worms were found, as they range from being on a hillside near the camp to a full half-mile away. But if Bobby had gotten lost, why would he just leave these items lying around? This whole fishing story has been complicated by the recent account from Richard Heister, the nephew of the camp's director at that time, as he recalled an incident from the camp's gathering hall where an upset-looking boy pushed past him and ran outside while making unintelligible noises. Richard believes that this boy was Bobby, which would make sense since his hearing impairment made it really difficult for him to speak and form words, and Richard seemed convinced that this occurred on the same day when Bobby went missing. Granted, Richard recounted this story 60 years after the fact, so his memory might be faulty, but I don't think he's intentionally lying. His account suggests that something bad may have happened to Bobby at the camp, and the whole incident was covered up, and this would paint Richard's own uncle in a very unflattering light. I don't think Richard would volunteer this information unless he was sincere. He strikes me as someone who wants the full truth to come to light, even if it reveals some potentially dark secrets about a close family member. You see, until Richard shared this story, there was nothing to indicate that Bobby was unhappy at Camp St. Malo. In fact, Bobby's surviving relatives have produced a letter he wrote and mailed to his parents shortly before he vanished, where he shared a number of stories about what a good time he was having. But Richard's account suggests that something really upset Bobby on the day he went missing, which could have paved the way for his death. Sadly, as a hearing-impaired boy, Bobby would have been a particularly vulnerable target for a sexual predator, because if he was abused, it would have been all the more difficult for Bobby to tell someone due to his difficulties with communicating. This whole situation is further complicated by the account provided by Neil Hewitt in 2019 about how he declined to sell some candy to Bobby at the camp snack bar on the day he disappeared, and Bobby responded by running off. Of course, this story was not mentioned in any of the contemporary news coverage of the case, but we now have two separate accounts of Bobby running away because he was upset about something, even though the story about him fishing at the creek never gave off the impression that there was anything out of the ordinary. As you recall, Hewitt shared this story when Kevin Vaughn showed up at his residence to inquire about the sexual abuse allegations against him, and he denied ever harming Bobby, even though Vaughn never even asked him. If this account of the incident at the snack bar is true, then it goes against the official narrative for the case and might make Hewitt the last known person to see Bobby alive. The whole thing might not be as concerning if not for the fact that Hewitt was the one who discovered Bobby's scapula nearly 1 year later. We know that at least 3 of the priests who worked as counselors at Camp St. Malo during the summer of 1958 went on to be accused of sexual abuse: Hewitt, Harold Robert White, and Gerald Rapola. White sounds like one of the worst sexual predators in the history of the clergy, since he had at least 70 known victims, and while it's certainly possible that White and Rapola were molesting children at the camp during that time period, thus far, neither of them have been connected to Bobby. But these links between Bobby and Hewitt are pretty troubling. So obviously, back in 1959, identifying Bobby's remains with DNA testing was not an option, and since his skull was not recovered, they couldn't use dental records. The identification was pretty much made because scraps of Bobby's clothing and a hearing aid battery case were found with the remains, so logically, who else could the victim have been? Even though Bobby's skull could not be found, I'm sure the authorities just attributed that to animals scattering the remains around, and never envisioned that it might actually be in the possession of the camp's director. Obviously, even if Reverend Richard Heister came across the skull himself during a search of the area, there's zero reason for him not to inform the authorities unless something shady had taken place. So if you look through the newspaper archives, the first date where the discovery of the remains got reported was July the 9th, 1959, because even though Bobby's scapula and a scrap of his clothing had been found 6 days earlier, the authorities needed time to track down and inform Bobby's parents because they were traveling. That explanation does make sense, but what's more concerning is the recent revelation that Reverend Heister did not actually contact the Rocky Mountain Park National Rangers about the discovery of the scapula until July the 6th, 3 days after the fact. So why such a lengthy delay? If something like this happened today, there might have been more suspicion towards the camp by law enforcement, but this was back in 1959, before scandals about sexual abuse within the Catholic Church became public knowledge. Back then, I'm sure no one had any reason to suspect that a priest and a bunch of seminary students who ran a Catholic boys' camp might be predators who were hiding something. If Reverend Heister's delay did not raise any red flags with Bobby's own parents, then I can see why it didn't draw any suspicion from law enforcement. At first, Hewitt only found Bobby's scapula and one scrap of clothing, and the rest of his remains and clothing were not discovered until a more extensive search a few days later. The scapula was supposedly beneath some underbrush in a mountain ravine, and it might seem like a convenient coincidence that Hewitt just happened to notice it. If there was a cover-up, perhaps the responsible parties figured that people would continue to search the area for Bobby's remains for years to come, but if a conclusive proof was produced that Bobby was deceased, then this would put a stop to the search efforts. If the remains showed no obvious signs of foul play, the authorities would just assume that Bobby got lost and died of exposure and not suspect anything nefarious. Technically, this strategy did pay off, because if the counselors had not been implicated in the child sex abuse scandal decades later, I don't think anyone would have taken a second look at Bobby's case. So now let's talk about the truly weird part of this story, and that's the discovery of the skull. Again, I must remind everyone that DNA testing has not been completed, so we still can't even be certain yet that the skull belongs to Bobby. But for the purposes of this analysis, let's just assume that it does. If Bobby was murdered, I can understand the desire to ensure the skull was never found, particularly if it contained any noticeable signs of foul play, such as blunt force trauma. When 9 News ran their story about this in 2021, Bobby's surviving relatives gave them permission to share a photo of the skull on the chance that it could help generate new tips or new information. I've looked at the photo, and to the naked eye, there doesn't seem to be any noticeable signs of trauma, but that may be a piece of information which law enforcement have withheld from the public. But if somebody wanted to cover up a murder, why not just get rid of the skull altogether? Why keep it around for years? Now, Tom McCloskey, the man who turned the skull into the authorities, he did not want to be interviewed on camera, but he agreed to share the story about how the skull came to be in his possession. Unfortunately, because his account is being shared secondhand, the wording in the 9 News article is a bit ambiguous and could be open to interpretation. But to avoid any potential confusion, here are the exact words they used. Quote, Joseph McCloskey died in 1980, and Tom McCloskey said he took possession of it a couple years later. Tom McCloskey said that the only thing his father ever told him was that it may be the skull of a boy who disappeared from the camp. He said he could not remember his dad's exact words. Over the years, he said he tried several times to identify the boy and find news stories about his disappearance. End quote. So the obvious question everyone has asked is, why did Tom not turn the skull over to the authorities immediately? Why did it take him over 40 years to come forward? I mean, granted, even though Tom said he checked for news stories, it's not like he could just look up unsolved missing children's cases on Google back in 1980. Bobby Bizup's story got virtually no media coverage between 1959 and 2020, so I can see why it would take so long for Tom to put 2 and 2 together. But even so, should the presence of a skull in his father's possession cause Tom to become a lot more suspicious? Well, since Tom has never directly commented about this series of events, we might be missing some context about how they transpired. I mean, I'm sure he didn't suspect that his father was a serial killer who was holding onto the remains of murdered children as trophies, and I think we need to remember that Joseph McCloskey was a doctor. We don't know what kind of doctor he was, but while this practice is not as common today, it was not all that unusual back then for doctors to acquire human skulls or bones and keep them in their possession for the purposes of studying human anatomy. So from Tom's perspective, his father having a skull may not have seemed that odd because he could have obtained it legally. This is actually not the first case I've ever seen where an individual has found human remains among their loved one's possessions after they died, but it wasn't for nefarious reasons. As an example, look at the 1928 disappearances of Glenn and Bessie Hyde, which was covered on Unsolved Mysteries in episode number 121 of The Trail Went Cold. The couple vanished while running the rapids of the Colorado River in the Grand Canyon, but before this happened, they paid a visit to a man named Emery Kolb, and 5 decades later, after Kolb died, his grandson found a human skeleton inside a canoe in his boathouse with a gunshot wound in the skull. There was speculation that the remains belonged to Glenn Hyde and that Kolb may have murdered him, but the victim turned out to be an unidentified John Doe who had shot himself in the Grand Canyon years after the Hydes went missing. The circumstances of how these remains wound up in Kolb's boathouse are still a bit murky, but Kolb was a representative on the county coroner's journey at the time that John Doe was found, so it seems like he may have chosen to take the bones home, put them in his boathouse, and then simply forgot about them for the next several decades before he died. So perhaps Tom McCloskey thought it was a similar scenario with his own father until he learned about Bobby Bizup's story. Obviously, we have no idea how this skull wound up in Joseph McCloskey's possession to begin with, but the reason there's a good chance it's Bobby's is that Joseph apparently mentioned that it belonged to a boy who disappeared from a camp, and he was once close friends with Reverend Richard Heister. While I can think of a number of reasons why Reverend Heister would have decided to hold onto the skull, why would he have given it to Dr. McCloskey? Well, even though Heister was the director of a camp which employed a number of pedophiles, he was never himself accused of any sexual offenses. But according to the sexual abuse report which was released in 2019, his predecessor, Reverend Joseph Bassetti, was accused of abusing at least one teenage boy, and there were multiple children who were victimized at Camp St. Malo during the 1950s and 1960s. So it's not unreasonable to assume that Heister could have found out about these incidents and swept them under the rug. But of course, if Bobby was abused and the whole thing escalated into murder, that's an entirely different level. At this point, we still don't know for certain if Heister was ever in possession of the skull, but if he held on to it, perhaps it was a result of some sort of subconscious guilt, and he wanted to keep some evidence around in case he ever felt a desire to come forward and reveal the truth about what happened. However, even if Heister and Joseph McCloskey were close friends, how did things get to the point where the skull wound up in McCloskey's possession? Why would McCloskey pass it along to his son without sharing the full story about where it came from? The biggest obstacle with trying to make sense out of this whole thing is that most of the people who would have had direct knowledge or involvement in what transpired have since passed away. But one person from that time period who is still alive and may have the full answers is Neil Hewitt. Even though Hewitt left the priesthood over 40 years ago, he was still defrocked after all the sexual abuse allegations against him came out, and these days, it sounds like he's not even trying to deny what he did. If you watch the recording of the conversation he had on his front porch with Kevin Vaughn, it's quite a sight to behold, as he acknowledges that he did bad things to Michael Smilanic and Stuart Saki, and even breaks down crying at one point. However, when Bobby Bizup's name is mentioned, Hewitt starts volunteering information which no one even asked him about, and makes it clear that he didn't do anything to Bobby except deny him candy. I'm assuming that the reason why Hewitt has never been charged with any sex crimes is because the statute of limitations on them may have expired, but as I'm sure you're well aware, there is no statute of limitations on murder. So even if Hewitt felt compelled to confess to all of the other bad things he did, he still may have drawn the line at admitting his potential culpability in a boy's death. I haven't seen anything to indicate that Hewitt has passed away, so he will be turning 87 years old at some point this year, and time is running out to implicate him in Bobby's death. Of course, I'm not going to flat out say that Hewitt killed Bobby, because we technically still don't know how the boy died. Even though a new investigation has been opened, the case has still technically not been reclassified as a homicide and is listed as a suspicious death. An alternate possibility is that perhaps Bobby really did die of exposure and exhaustion, but it came about because he was abused by someone at the camp, which upset him so much that he ran off into the woods. So even if a homicide didn't exactly take place, the sexual abuse could have still played a direct role in Bobby's death. And for all we know, the DNA testing could reveal that the skull does not actually belong to Bobby, though that would only open up a ton of additional questions. If it does belong to Bobby, then I'm sure there was a major cover-up at that camp, because no one is going to hold onto a skull like that for completely innocent reasons. Given the amount of predators who were working there at that time, it's even possible that Hewitt was not the person who abused or killed Bobby, but at the very least, I'm sure he knows the full truth about what happened. At this point, the only thing I do feel certain about is that Bobby did not die because he simply got lost and wandered off. The amount of child sexual abuse which has been covered up by the Catholic Church is truly shameful, but this particular case is especially disturbing because the victim was so vulnerable and the whole thing may have crossed the line into murder. Given the number of years that have passed, I have to give the authorities a lot of credit for their willingness to open a new investigation and give Bobby's death a second look. After all this time, the chances of the perpetrator or perpetrators being brought to justice are not high, but at the very least, the truth could eventually be uncovered. I will definitely keep you apprised of any further developments, such as if and when the DNA testing on this skull takes place. In the meantime, should you happen to have any information on the death of Bobby Bizup, please call the National Park Service's Investigative Services Branch tip line at 888-653-0009. That's 888-653-0009. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Another reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. This past month, I released an episode about the unsolved 2012 kidnapping of Violet Ripken, the mother of famous Baltimore Orioles baseball player Cal Ripken Jr., who was abducted from her home by an unidentified man who inexplicably kept her in captivity for 23 hours before returning her unharmed. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and my two co-hosts, Jules and Ashley, discuss another case from Unsolved Mysteries, the unexplained 1984 death of Kurt McFall. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries. I'd also like to give a shout out to our most recent listeners who have signed up with us on Patreon this week, and they are Christine P., Autumn F., Horace, and Jenna J.L. Thank you all so much for your support. Anyway, I've previously announced that The Trail Went Cold is going to be appearing at the True Crime Podcast Festival later this year, which is taking place from August the 25th to the 27th at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel in Austin, Texas. Well, we've now got a specialized promo code which you can use in order to get a 15% discount on tickets to the event. So if you would like to purchase tickets, please visit their website at truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use our promo code TRAIL in order to get a 15% discount. Once again, that's truecrimepodcastfestival.com and the promo code is TRAIL. Hope to see you there. I just want to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, or Spotify. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for another brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.